shall be one. America, you shall stand as one. And those from the north and the south and the east and the west shall say, our plans have been foiled. We did not prosper with the weapons that we sent against this nation. We did not prosper because unity began to arise from the states within America. Because I called my people, the remnant, I called those that were called and elected for this day and for this purpose. And I can hear the sound of unity coming from this nation, says the Lord.
Greetings, everyone, and I welcome you to my den. I want to speak about something today. You just heard me shouting from the den when God moved upon me to speak about unity. Isn't it uncanny that just a few days later we'd have so much discord, so many people screaming out because of the verdict? And I'm not going to get into that now because, you know, everybody's announced what they feel, and all I can tell you is I've got to deal with it from a kingdom perspective and how we as a people should react and how we should be praying now. If God, on the Saturday before the verdict, spoke about unity so strongly and so passionately as he did, you just saw it, then I believe that this is a contradiction to what he has already planned. Because first of all, he looks to his people for unity, and that aroma comes to him from his people, not the world. You cannot expect the world to behave the way people of God are supposed to behave. So what we did was on Saturday, we worshiped the Lord. There was unity, and it was absolutely beautiful. Then he spoke about unity in the United States of America, because there's so much discord. Now you're seeing it displayed on your screens. You've watched it. You know, during the autumn, God told me not to watch television or read any news articles, and so I'm briefed. However, on Saturday, he was very clear about it and spoke about a rage that would come from the White House. We may not have seen that already. I don't know, but I'm not here to defend anybody, but to speak as a prophetic voice. Think about Elijah during his time when they'd been through a famine. There was more discord and disunity in Israel than in a long, long time. Jezebel had killed the prophets. Many of them were hiding away. In other words, the prophetic voice had no power. It had no influence. The only one that was really prophesying and was hidden away was Elijah. And so the minute you smother the prophetic and you try and destroy and kill the prophetic, whether it's in a church or it's in a nation or a business, there's always has to be that visionary there that speaks about the future. And when people shut that voice out, then you have the Lord God of Israel being brought down to their level. And so it happened with the prophets of Baal. They had total control because of Jezebel. Now, Jezebel's husband, the king, was Ahab. She's more well known because of what she did. But Elijah gathered all the prophets together and all the people together and said, how long are you going to be in two opinions? Either you serve God or you don't. And once he received the unity of the people by saying, yes, we will serve the Lord, that's when the power of the prophets of Baal were destroyed. Now that's a story by itself, and we see how things began to change after that. There was an abundance of rain, but a very interesting thing happens, and I'd like to tell you the story quickly. Because my belief is that if God told me to prophesy about unity, not everybody's ever going to be united, the whole country with millions of people, but there are a remnant of people that can bring unity to God's throne, and he will answer them because of that. That's you and I. The story is about Ahab after all of this. You can imagine now they've received an abundance of rain, the drought is at the end, the famines come to the end, which we are approaching now, according to the Spirit of God, in times and seasons. That comes to an end, but something drastic happens after that famine comes to an end. Ben-Hadad in 1 Kings 20, and I'll tell you the story because of our time, because we're going to go into the Ferguson prayer time that I had when I stood in that very same place where I believe you saw the fires and the looting taking place. We stood in that very street and stood there and made a proclamation and prayed. Next morning we went in we had a huge prayer gathering in St. Louis, in Ferguson, and you're going to see that now, and you need to watch it because God will always answer the prayers of His people. And when God commissioned me as a prophet to go there and put my boots on the ground and take my team with me, a lot of people may say, well, why did this happen then? Well, we're not praying for this now. We're praying for the result, for God to speak, to God to minister, to move on our behalf and to stop this. It's happening all over the country. And you will have that kind of outburst and outrage. But what have they done from the top? Our president and their leaders have a huge responsibility to speak life into the situation and healing into the situation. And of course, he's tried. But what happened with Ahab was the king of Syria gathered forces and came against Ahab. And this is what he said to Ahab, the king of Israel. Your silver and gold are mine. Your loveliest wives and your children, your choice children, are mine. That's what he wants from this nation. That's what he wants from us. That's the cry of our enemy. I want your silver and your gold. I want your loveliest wives, obviously for the purpose of procreation in the future, and your children, because we don't want your children to be able to take the name of God and use it against us. And you know what the terrible thing about it was that Ahab consented. This is what he said to the king. He said, O Lord, O king, just as you say, I and all that I have are yours. Hoping that he would appease him. We've noticed that hasn't worked with these terror organizations, these terror nations like Iran and Syria. It doesn't work. They're not going to love you if you appease them and agree with them. And that's what's happened with this administration. Maybe his heart was right when he first started saying, well, I'm charming and they'll just love me and everything will be fine. It's not going to be fine. And I'll show you why. Because the minute Ahab said that to the king who was demanding, we're talking about a Middle Eastern king, demanding the best, the choice. When the king heard that Ahab had submitted to that, he said, okay, I'll tell you what, you're not only going to deliver your silver and your gold, your wives, your children, but I'm going to send and search your houses and the house of your servants, and whatever is pleasant in your eyes, they will put into their hands and take it. In other words, America and the nations of the earth that believe in the freedom that we're supposed to have and enjoy, this is their desire for you. Whatever is pleasant in your eyes, even that we're going to take away from you. Well, of course, Ahab didn't like that. Went to his elders and spoke to them about it and said, well, what are we going to do about this? And so they said, well, we're going to have to go to war. Well, Ahab didn't want to go to war. So then he spoke to Ben-Hadad again and said to him, listen, are you sure you want to do this? And Ben-Hadad came back and said, the gods do so to me, or more for us, if enough dust is left of Samaria for a handful of each of the people who follow me. In other words, you're dead. And this is what the king said, pretty good saying. You tell him, let not the one who puts on his armor boast like the one who's taken it off. You haven't even gone into battle yet, and you're boasting. So that's just the story. But now a prophet comes to Ahab and says to him, you see this great multitude that are coming against you? I will deliver them into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So Ahab the king says, how is this going to happen? And he says this, and I feel God's Spirit as I'm saying this to you, by the young leaders of the provinces, by the young men, young blood, the young people are going to do it. They're going to take down these enemies because Ahab, you've compromised and you'll never do it yourself. Tells me that God has a plan for our young people. It tells me that the reason that this has taken place in Ferguson and in many other places is because the enemy wants the end of the young people, to destroy them. So what happens is the young rulers go out, they strike at the enemy, and Ben-Hadad, who is Ben-Hadad, who is the leader of the army that's attacking Israel, of course, he sees that they boasted a little bit too much, and they're overcome. So, of course, the king of Israel went out with a horse and chariot to kill them. But now what happens is Ben-Hadad gets away. He is spared. And so the prophet comes to the king of Israel and said, now, you better go and strengthen yourself and take note and see what you should do. For in the spring of this year, of the year, the king of Syria will come up against you again. And there's something about spring here that I want you to see. And you may be saying, well, we want to know about Ferguson. Well, it's all about this. It's because of what the enemy has struck today, or a few days ago, what he has done to strike at the very heart of these young people and this nation, to divide them again. So the prophet says, watch out, because in the spring, this is going to happen again. You're going to have a similar attack. So watch out for it. Does that mean that we have no chance of any unity? No. If God said there is a spirit of unity that is upon the nation, then it's happening. It must be happening amongst these people. But God will bring unity. So he tells him the king's going to come back in spring. He's going to share something very interesting about spring as well in this regard. But could it be that the enemy would try again to do something like he's done with Ferguson again in the spring? We'll wait and see, but I found that interesting as I was reading that. Anyway, so it was in the spring of that year, of the following year, that Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Aphek to fight against the children of Israel again. And once again a prophet comes and says, okay, Ahab, you had your first chance. You see this multitude? The God is going to deliver them into your hands. And so I'll just tell the story very quickly so I can finish it. So what happens is they happen to overcome them, and a huge wall falls over onto some of the men that are fighting against them. And so what happens is Ben-Hadad said to him, listen, I want to make a treaty with you, because he realizes the Israelis have overcome him. The power of God has been with them by the prophetic word. Only the prophetic word. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is there is a prophet here, and there are others as well, but I'm speaking of myself today, are prophesying, and that's why there's been leniency. That's where God's given another chance, so to speak. You have Iran at this very moment that are laughing at our nation. They're laughing at us because of a very similar thing. So Ben-Hadad, he's shown his colors. They know he wants the silver, the gold, their wives, their treasures, everything. But he's been overcome twice. And guess what happens? Ahab the king spares him again and actually makes a treaty with him. And so what happens as a result of that is the son, one of the prophets, it's a weird story, but he goes over to somebody and says, strike me. And the man won't strike him, because he's a prophet, and the prophet says to him, because you didn't strike me, a lion's going to eat you up in the street. Weird, but anyway. So he goes to another person. The prophet says, strike me. So the guy strikes him so that he's wounded. And he puts a bandage over his eyes, and he goes to the king of Israel, who is coming on a horse, and he stops him. And the king of Israel says, what do you want? And of course, he doesn't know it's the prophet. And then he said to him, he tells him a story about how he was supposed to be looked after by somebody, but he never was. And so the king's listening to this weird story that the person who was supposed to guard him never guarded him, and this was the result. So the king of Israel said, well, that's your judgment, and so you yourself have decided it. In other words, you don't need to really even know the story. The fact is, he's saying, I asked someone to look after me, never guarded me. And he says, well, that was your judgment, too bad. And then he takes his bandage off his eyes, the prophet, and he says, thus says the Lord, because you've let slip out of your hand a man who I appointed to utter destruction. Therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people. Now what I'm trying to show you is that he was given a chance not to compromise and not to enter into a treaty. The story about Ferguson is so much bigger than what we realize. It's not about a white cop that got away with it, because a young black man that died. Let's not even dehumanize them by using colors and so on. and status. This is about a spiritual force, a wickedness that is trying to come into this nation and raise a bunch of people, young people, that feel they have no hope, that are candidates for terrorism. You may laugh and say, oh, that's nonsense. That'll never happen. Believe me, they're being set up for that. And that's where you and I can begin to pray prophetically. Because these young people are not going to be lost and given over, but rather they will become warriors of the King. I prophesy that over these young people, even though you may see things and say, look how angry they are, God is able by His grace and by His power and by the prophetic prayers and the prophetic words of His prophets to give a victory to this nation again. However, what's happening with the president, and I spoke about a rage that's going to come from the White House, maybe not even him, but whoever, watch for that. What we're trying to say to you is when God spoke that word many years ago, a few years ago, 2 years ago maybe, from Detroit, Michigan, where He said, if you do not have a captivating love for Israel, He said they will be wiped off the streets. In other words, there will be blood on the streets. There will be fire and whatever, destruction. And here we are again. Iran, you've got to understand something. Iran is one huge threat against Israel. Yes. By the way, people, not only Israel, America. Believe me, they're smiling. Remember those crooked smiles? They're lying behind that smile. And so I'm not trying to make you fearful. Pray always for your president. Pray for him. Yes. Because I'm telling you, the enemy is out there to totally destroy him. He doesn't even realize it. So with that all being said now, let's go into Ferguson where we stood.